Hello again guys, and welcome back to another Big L Devlin video here at the House of Devlin. Today is a continuation of our discussion on paganism, specifically the runes and the magic of the runes. Within this video we'll have an initial discussion on what the rune of Ansuz, which is the rune that we're looking at today within the first Deity. It's the fourth rune of the first Deity, if I remember correctly. Yes, 1, 2, 3, 4. Yep, the fourth rune of the first Deity. And we'll be discussing that in detail. We'll be initially just discussing it on a sort of a take a step back perspective, so to speak. So we're looking at what it means on a sort of general large scale sort of scheme, as we've discussed it before within the runes of cosmology, and we'll be then going into more detail on how it exists within everyday life. It's quite a subtle rune on Ansuz. It's one that you wouldn't necessarily use within, say, gouging magic, for example, or obviously it has its role within divination magic, but it's not something that is a rune that, like for example, like Forizas has multiple uses, for example, and some profound uses as well. Ansuz is very subtle in its use, and as I say, it's more of a rune of observation. We observe its effects within life, and that's really the beauty of this rune, is that it exists very much in front of us, and we may not already be aware of it. And so we'll be discussing what it is in that aspect after the video the little clip that I show you, where I show you how I made my own runestone. This is the runestone that I made to represent Ansuz. So I'll show you how I made that myself. I engraved it with a Dremel engraver and then painted into the engraving just to make the rune a little bit more visible. Just before we go into that, and then after that we'll talk about magic and also how it's used in magic, and as I say, more specifically sort of how it's seen within everyday life. We'll talk about Ansuz as a sort of as I say, a grand scheme of things. In the grand scheme, what is it? Well, traditionally Ansuz is representative of in the old days, so to speak, of speech or communication, and it's also seen as directly representing either a spirit or a god, most specifically Odin himself. So it's got a variety of different meanings, but the most important ones to sort of consider are that sort of dual meaning of communication and speech means the same thing essentially, because that you'll see how that sort of represents its sort of cosmological sort of meaning. It relates directly to speech essentially, but then it's also then to consider its links to Odin himself, because this is how we see it. It's sort of almost within everyday life in a very subtle manner, and it's also then how we can use it within magic to expand knowledge, because of course Odin is the god of wisdom, so you can imagine it's linked to gaining wisdom. Ansuz, as I say, is traditionally, if not considered as a link to Odin, it is considered as speech, and this is actually how most Anglo-Saxons and also the ancient Norse would have seen it, rather than as a link to Odin himself. It was more of a later consideration or Celtic consideration. And so, as with speech or communication, the very first process of speaking or speech is, of course, thought. You cannot speak without thinking about what you're going to say. Now, I know there's plenty of us who say before we think, but there is a thought process, at least in the subconscious aspect of ourselves, rather than active thought. But when we really want our words to mean something, we are actively thinking about what we're going to say and predicting what we're going to say and how we're going to say it, because of course it's not always what you say, it's how you say it also. And so there's a lot of thought that goes behind speech, and so thought precedes speech, and thought is simply the first action, because it is it's an action, it's a fulfillment of a probability. Even thoughts are fulfilled fates ultimately, even though we can't tangibly grasp at them. A thought or a fulfillment of a thought, or the thought process, is actually a fulfillment of a fate. To have a thought is exactly that. It's something coming to life very temporarily, and then obviously gradually going away if we don't act upon that thought. And so thought, as I say, is actually the first action of intention. So intention's not a a fulfilled fate. It's not a fulfilled probability. Intention is more like a kind of ambition. It's a sort of emotion essentially. And so when you have intention, that acts itself out, as I say, through a thought process, and then can come out through the mouth as speech. Now intention is important because on a cosmological scales we're looking at the fulfillment of fate through feihu, which is desire, and progressing obviously into a ruse, which is the power that drives desire forwards, with the willpower of the universe behind it in the form of Fourier. When we give Ansuz to this sort of forward momentum of fate, we give it intention, and intention gives something direction. When something that is moving forwards or progressing forwards, when it's given when there's an intention behind it, it must have a direction. Because if you intend to achieve something, you know where the end point is hopefully going to be, and you know where you are. There's an understanding of space ultimately between you and the finished article, so to speak. And it might not be a physical space, but there's, as I said, there's that analysis, that thoughtful analysis of how a process will unfold in front of you. As I say, it's almost like understanding it's not just what you say, it's how you say it to get around the desired effect to, in regards to talking to people. And it's the same sort of thing with fate. When you give it intention, you give it a direction. And so as a result, when fate gains a direction, it will fulfill a very specific probability at this point. And so as a result, because of its direction, alongside all the previous 3 runes, it will then achieve, because bear in mind the rune that directly feeds off Ansuz is of course Rezu, sometimes pronounced Rado, but its traditional pronunciation is Rezu. And Rezu directly feeds off Ansuz, and Rezu is the fulfillment of a probability. It's often represented as a wagon or as movement, and it is literally that, the movement into an action, or beginning of a fulfillment of an action. And so, as I say, the intention behind that fulfillment is very important, or the direction behind that fulfillment is very important, because it determines what is achieved ultimately, and how it is achieved, and the effect that achievement has on the outside world, essentially the aspects around it. So Ansuz is actually a very, very powerful rune when one considers it in that respect, because it has literally a direct effect on how a particular fate is fulfilled and the effect that it has. Now obviously that's very important, but regardless of its power, it is still very subtle on how it represents itself in our world. Or it's not exactly subtle, but it's hard to spot when you don't know what to look for. But when you know what to look for, you can actually see the beauty. It's beautiful. You can see Ansuz unfolding in front of you in life, and it's like proof that Ansuz, or what Ansuz represents, exists. It's a wonderful, wonderful thing to observe. Now, before we go on to, as I say, discussion of Ansuz in its more subtle aspects, so how it exists within life, and then its more sort of less subtle, how you would use it in Majik itself. I just want to discuss with you, before we go on to also how I made the rune. I just do that as a little interim for you guys, a little break, because these discussions sometimes can be quite heavy. I just want to say that read to you a couple of poems that are, ancient poems from both the Anglo-Saxons and the ancient Norse. I've got 2 poems here for you, which gives you, as again, a sort of idea on how the ancient people viewed this rune. Now, obviously, perspective changes over time. With understanding and knowledge. Obviously they had more knowledge than us, in the sense that they knew more of their religion than we do. Paganism, some of the knowledge of paganism has been lost over time due to persecution and stuff like this, and just erosion of time. It's one of the problems with spreading your religion through oration rather than through written text, is that it can degrade over time, but at the same time it also evolves. So our knowledge has progressed in other ways, but it has regressed in other areas. So our knowledge is not necessarily lesser than the ancient people. I don't see it as lesser. I see it as different, because of course not only is our knowledge base a little bit different, we've progressed in certain areas of our understanding and knowledge of paganism, but we've also regressed in other areas which we may not have a connection to anymore, and that's just a process of evolution, right? But also the way that we've grown up, the societies that we exist in, these all has an influence on our own thought processes, and thus, as I say, our interpretation of things and how we fulfill fates and so on and so forth. So living, just even if we had all the knowledge and nothing had changed that the ancients had in modern day times, because society's different, it's got different demands from us and so on and so forth, we would be interpreting our religion differently anyway. So that's the beauty of having a religion that's taught through oration. It's not set in a book. It's not set in stone. It can be malleable. Okay, not manipulated. Text can be manipulated because you can use it to, as I say, sort of give you religious purpose to what you're doing, and can make you feel that you're doing something right when you're doing something wrong. We've all seen it, especially in modern day times. There's a lot going on where religion is used as an excuse to hurt people, but we don't have manipulation of our text, of our religion, because we can't manipulate something that is not set in stone. We can't use it as a binding law, so to speak. But as I say, it can be malleable. We can change it to represent how our society thinks at the time that we exist. But this is a good insight to see how the ancients, as I say, once saw the runes. Okay, so first of all, I'm going to read to you an Anglo-Saxon rune poem, and it goes as such. Mouth is a shaper of speech, wisdom's prop and wise men's comfort, and every peer's ease and hope. It's pretty easy to understand that poem, so I won't go into it. But the next one's quite an interesting one. It's an Old Norse rune poem. Okay, now they didn't call Ansuz. They used the word os, okay, to represent the rune. It's the same thing, but a different, obviously, word, but it has the same meanings and stuff. Okay, so, and they reference the word, so that's why I'm just telling you so you know what I'm talking about. The poem goes as such: Os is the way of most journeys, but a scabbard is of swords. Very short poem, but quite a lot to discuss there, mostly in the second aspect of the poem, the second line. But a scabbard is of swords. This I like very much, because when you know that os, or Ansuz, is related directly to speech, to communication, and when we see in the Anglo-Saxon poem, the first line, mouth is a shaper of speech, we see that mouth is directly represented there, or referenced even. It's highly suggestive that the scabbard in this case is a metaphor for the mouth, and that the sword is a metaphor for speech or communication. And so the mouth is not only the propagation of speech, it's not only the necessary start point or the source of speech, although we know the source goes further than that, goes first of all to force, and then obviously intention behind that. Well, actually it's intention and then force, so sorry, one way around. But the scabbard, as I say, or the mouth, is also a container. That means a container can be both open and closed. Okay, and you have control over whether that container is open and closed, and how much open it is. And we're going back now to what I discussed earlier about it's not just what you say, but how you say it, and also importantly, as indicated by this poem, when you say it. You don't have to blab your mouth all the time, it's most importantly, it's the right thing to say at the right time in the right manner, okay, in the correct manner. So I love that poem because referencing the mouth as a scabbard and words as a sword is beautiful in that sense. You get an understanding of the subtlety of Ansuz and speech as in general, but also speech, as we say, as a sword. We all know that words can hurt, you know, that words can be dangerous, okay, and obviously, you know, some people have a greater way of using words to hurt than others, and we're not just talking bullying or things like this here. We're talking like politicians, for example. You know, they can arouse people, and we'll go into this when we go over its subtlety in society. But you know, politicians can really, you know, go to war and cause wars with their words, and they're not doing anything. They're just using words. Remember, all the wars that we've been through, World War II, with, you know, with Adolf Hitler. You know, he was, you know, roused the German nation to obviously voting him in, and then he used his words then to cause damage to his own people as well as to the rest of the world, you know. And so we can see just how powerful words are there. But in every war, there's a politician or king or some kind of leader involved using words to cause war. And it's obviously, words can be dangerous in other ways as well, but I'm just using the sort of most extreme example there. And so that's why I like that poem. I'll read it to you one more time now that you've kind of seen the sort of subtlety behind it. Os, or Ansuz, is the way of most journeys, but a scabbard is of swords. I like it. Right, guys, I'll show you how I made this rune. It'll be put on fast forward or whatever, so it won't take too long. It will just sort of a little quick, as a break, as I say, maybe get yourself a glass of water or something, and then I'm going to certainly do that, and then I'm going to talk to you about the subtleties of how it exists within life, how to observe it, and then how to use it in magic, although that is a minimal sort of contribution to today's video. It's not a massive thing that you can use within magic. As I say, it's more observation of it in practice. Lovely, guys. I'll see you in a minute. Alright guys, so as I say, I did that rune with a Dremel automatic engraver, so it's just something you plug into the mains and use it to power. There are other engravers you can use that are battery powered and stuff, but I find obviously using a mains engraver the best way to do it. So if you want to engrave your stones rather than just simply painting on them, I would recommend that. Okay, and you can turn the power up to get different depths, or you know, some stones are more resistant than others, so you have to turn the power up to get to the depth that you need anyway. With like the hematite, for example, that was quite resistant, but this particular stone wasn't quite as bad to work with. Okay, so enough of that. let's get on to the gritty of what Ansuz means and the subtlety of it. There's a few things to discuss really here. It's as I say, it's a subtle rune, but there are complicated aspects to it. And I don't really know where to start as such, but why don't we start with a direct reference to Ascent Embla and its reference to the speech aspects of the rune are, as I say, more subtle and complicated. This is a little bit more obvious, okay? So Ansuz, as I say, can not only represent speech or communication, but can represent the gods or God or spirit, or, as I say, more specifically, Odin himself. And as a sort of digressed point of that, wisdom. Okay. Now, the reason that Ansuz is linked so heavily to Odin is, of course, Odin. When men and women were created, we were created from the vegetation, the trees. I think it was an ash tree for ask, and it was a birch tree for Embla. It sometimes changes that tree, but it's most often referenced as a birch tree. But there are one of a tree that it could be, but I see it as a birch tree. Okay, now regardless of what trees men and women came from, it doesn't really matter. But when he carved us from the trees, we were still fairly inanimate objects. We were living because we were carved from trees. Trees are living also, so we had life, but we weren't aware. Okay, we didn't have what we would describe as self-awareness or consciousness. And consciousness in paganism is, of course, just another term for soul. Okay, the modern word would be soul. Okay, but we would, as I say, describe it as a consciousness or awareness. Okay, and Odin's gift to us was the gift that he himself was bestowed by Odhumbla, the sort of creative spirit that existed within Niflheim and gave all the gods life, including all the gods were given life by Odhumbla. Okay, Odin bestowed upon us that very same gift, as I say, and it's called the breath of ecstasy, or sometimes the madness of the gods, or the breath of the gods. There's a variety of different names for it. But ultimately what happened was we gained awareness, we gained consciousness, we gained a soul. But that soul, as such, that makes us living, makes us aware of the outside world, begins with thought. Because, of course, if trees, for example, or any inanimate life form live, and they are most capable probably of observing the outside world in one way or another. Yes, they may not have eyes like us, for example, or noses, so they may be lacking a lot of the senses that we have, but they can still interact with the outside world. For example, a tree will angle its leaves so that they are pointing most directly towards the sun. So it knows where the tree will know where the sun is, and will know how to angle its leaves to maximize the exposure of the leaves to the sun, and thus, increase its photosynthesis. So there is some awareness, as I say, of the world around it. Its roots grow towards water, for example. Again, it's aware of gravity. Roots aware of what is up and what is down. You never see a tree growing upside down. It always comes out of the earth, doesn't it? And the roots go down into the earth. So a tree is aware to some degree, not obviously to the same level as us, but to some degree of the outside world. And if we had that same kind of awareness, okay, we would be living, but we wouldn't be human. Instead, what Odin gave us was the ability, as I say, it was consciousness, but that is in its own right the ability to think, the ability to interpret, and thus develop intention, and thus action as a result of that. So he gave us Ansuz. He gave us Ansuz, which is, as I say, the ability to, because, yes, it's communication, but as I say, the first communication begins with thought, and that is a first action of intention. So, you know, he gave us intention, he gave us thought, and as a result we were able to act upon that, because now all of a sudden we gain an awareness of the world. And what is that awareness? Well, it's the ability to take in data from the outside world, to take in information from the outside world through our eyes, through our nose, through our skin, by touch, and everything else, and all the five senses essentially. And we take that data in, but then we don't just interpret it and sort of act, through instinct alone. We take that information in, and we have that conscious ability to interpret the information in a way that we want to interpret it, and thus we then give how we react to that information, we give it intention. Okay, and so we can act in an unpredictable manner to the information we're being provided with. For example, a very simple example of this, and how Ansuz and this breath of ecstasy is incorporated into us, and why we know we have a consciousness is, for example, it is self-preservation. For example, is very much a part of instinct of life. All life forms, no matter how simple they are, whether they be a plant or a tree or whatever, or be they us or something in between, any variety of animal, has self-preservation at heart. Even bacteria, has self-preservation. Okay, and so that's why we experience pain. And so if we were to go and pick something up that was very, very hot and was burning the skin, our natural instinct and reflex is to drop that thing that is hot, to protect ourselves, to preserve ourselves. But with Ansuz, all of a sudden you see how consciousness can change the intention of action, because the correct action is, yes, to drop the thing, get rid of it, to get away from it. But Ansuz allows us to interpret the information and make a decision with intention. And so if what was hot was, for example, a very expensive antique teapot, for example, that was worth £20,000 or something, right? No, $30,000, whatever. Would you drop it? Especially if you owned it, or your family member owned it? No, you probably wouldn't. You would bear the pain and find very quickly, but you would still delay the point at which you dropped it. You would find a table or something to put it on safely, and then you go, oh, that hurt. That's exactly what you do. That's what people do. And that is Ansuz, essentially. It is showing intention behind an action, because the action is actually incorrect. The action should be self-preservation, but you allow yourself to be hurt because you're trying to preserve something else that you, at that point in time, view as more valuable than you in some respects, or more valuable than the pain that you're receiving. And so you see Ansuz directly represented in that manner there, and that's something we all will have had an experience with. Ansuz is also commonly described as the foresight to see what actions you need to take to lead you to where you need to be. Okay, again, it's that sort of planning process that when you, as we were discussing with the sort of the prior three runes, the desire, the strength essentially, and the willpower of the universe being focused by Ansuz, which is intention, which gives it direction. We are essentially planning how we're going to achieve a probability, and the outcome of that probability, and the consequences of that outcome, of that fulfilling that probability on the things around it. And so we see Ansuz, when anything is thought out and planned, when you make a plan essentially as to where you need to be more than want to be, ultimately, it is the ability to see what you need, as I say, rather than what you want, and it is the best advice given at just the right time. As I say, it's not just like speech. You can say the same thing, but if you say it differently at a different time period to a different person or whatever, the meaning behind it can change significantly if you just alter one of those probabilities. And it's the same thing. It's about achieving a probability. It's not just about giving advice. It can be anything. It can be fulfilling an action, doing something in your life, but doing it in the right way, as I say, at the right time, with the right intentions and the right ambitions behind it. And this is how we see Ansuz coming into it again, where it's not really your conscious decision as such as well, but it's a fate ultimately guiding you towards something, but your interpretation of fate interlinking with it. And often it's associated with the sense of calmness that you feel when you are treading upon the right path, or your fate, when you're fulfilling your fate correctly. You do feel an element of calmness in your life. There is little sort of self-confrontation, so to speak. You feel at peace with the world, and you just flow with life in the manner of Laguz, for example. But sometimes, obviously, it's possible to stray off, essentially, your intended fate and create your own fate to some degree, because, of course, fate can be manipulated, but destiny cannot. Destiny is an unavoidable fate, but fate is very hard to get off your path. But there are a variety of paths ahead of you, and sometimes it's the right path, but sometimes you find yourself falling either intentionally or unintentionally into the wrong path. And when you do, we've all felt it, haven't we? That nagging doubt that you have, where you just feel that something's not quite right, something's wrong. Even if things are going well around you, you don't feel completely satisfied. There's always that thing in the back of your head going, what's going on? And it's that nagging doubt that you're on the wrong path that is also Ansuz. So the feeling of calmness when you're on the right path, that's Ansuz. But the feeling of that, as I said, that nagging doubt that you get when you're not treading across, as I say, your correct fate path, that is also Ansuz. So it's heavily linked to fate, because of course the universe will have an intention behind your fate, but because we're able to ourselves interpret and alter fate as a result of our interpretations and ours, as I say, our intentions, we can subvert the intention of the universe. It's only when the universe gives a shit enough to create a destiny ultimately that we can't change things, but fate can be altered. As I say, there are a few things destined in our lives, but the only two that is common between us all is our birth and our death. Our birth is destined, as is our death. But for most of us, what we do in between our lives, yes, it's sort of heavily directed, but ultimately it is down to us. We choose what to do with our lives in between the day of our death and our day of our birth. So and that is a common sort of Viking mentality as well, that we're born on a certain day and we die a certain day, but what we do in between, well, that's down to us. That's exactly how the Vikings saw life, and why they didn't really fear death so much, because, well, they knew when it was coming, and as long as they lived well up to that point, then they would get what they were after. The Vikings, being the martial elite of ancient Scandinavian society, were, of course, one of the things they wanted to get to was Valhalla, most likely. So, it wasn't exactly something they feared death, okay, and they didn't fear battle as a result, okay. It's just a mental conditioning that you have when you have that kind of belief system. We see it in other people as well, like the samurai, for example, with their belief in Buddhism. Zen Buddhism is it, but where the Bushido code, where essentially they would be reincarnated into a better life if they die well, for example. But anyway, going beyond that, as I say, that is how we see Ansuz in life, or can feel it in life, so to speak. Now, how can you use Ansuz in magic? Well, within Gauda magic, this is something you wouldn't necessarily use too often, because it's less profound in its use, as I say, than say something like Foizas, which can have quite profound effects. Ansuz instead is simply there to help you make decisions. If you incantate or chant Ansuz repetitively and in the correct manner, it can help you, make a decision on or see the solution to a certain problem, for example. So it gives you that wisdom that you would associate with Odin. And it can be useful to help take emotion out of a decision as well. So you lock yourself off from your emotions and see things in black and white, and Ansuz can be used for that when repeating it, as I say, almost within meditation or in trance, can help you when you're focusing upon a certain aspect of your life, can help you see things more clearly. But it can also be used to help almost communicate with both your base self, your subconsciousness, and your higher self, your higher consciousness. Now, it's not often used to communicate with your higher consciousness. This is just very hard to do. You have to unlock your higher consciousness by progressing through Yera and making your way up to ultimately to Ophura, the end point. Okay, so there's no shortcuts to communicating with your higher self or being aware of your higher consciousness and the information that it receives, because, as I referenced before, Odin in paganism was the god who gave us consciousness, and that process of giving us consciousness left a permanent imprint on ourselves, and that imprint is essentially our third eye, as some people would say it, or our higher consciousness, as I say, pagans would describe it, or your higher self. And it's within your mind, essentially, it's within your consciousness, or it is essentially is your consciousness to some degree, but it's a part of your consciousness that you're unable to access. But that link that is connected between you and Odin and you and the gods and the spirit realms is a permanent one, and one that allows information to flow downwards into yourself from the spiritual realms. And this is how sometimes you just know things or gain knowledge of things over time and you're not sure where you got it from. Is from the higher consciousness, but the progression of knowledge comes from the higher consciousness, but then it's not ready to be processed by the human mind ultimately at this point, or your literal consciousness, your personality, your persona can't really interpret the information directly. It has to be sort of processed into a way that a human mind can see it. Because of course our higher consciousness is essentially spiritual in nature, and so that's why it can receive information from the spiritual realm. There's a direct sort of link, and there's no reintegration required. But then it's got to be translated into a way that people of the material realm, like ourselves, we are of the physical realm, we see things in a different way, obviously, than the spirit realms would. And we experience things in a different way than a spirit would, for example. And so that spiritual information needs to be translated into physical information. So it goes from the higher self, and instead of going directly to the consciousness, it goes to our base self, our subconsciousness, okay, to start off with. And it is here where our subconsciousness almost converts, but more accurately integrates the knowledge into ourselves, into a physical format, into chemical signals ultimately, that our body can then understand. And then once it's integrated completely, all of a sudden our consciousness can interpret it and understand it and know it. To start off with, it's a process of knowing it, understanding it, and then once you understand it, it then becomes integrated into your personality, into your consciousness, as well as then obviously your higher and lower consciousness. And so this process of knowledge progressing into your actual proper consciousness is, quite well understood by pagans. And as I say, using Gaudium magic, you can, in a trance typically, rather than meditation, because we don't really meditate as pagans, we go into trances. It's a very similar process, very similar state really. It's just, I suppose, a different terminology. But when in trance, you can use Gaudium magic, using Ansuz, repeating it again, and focusing on wisdom and knowledge and the connection that you have through your higher consciousness to the spiritual realms. You can try to speed up the process, essentially, that your base consciousness integrates the knowledge. You can almost communicate with your subconscious to some degree, and as a result glean a little bit of the information that is held up there a little faster than perhaps you would otherwise might. So you can gain wisdom from Ansuz. Now, as I say, Ansuz is a very subtle rune. As you can see, the way it's used, it's just to communicate with yourself, but as an extension of yourself, the spiritual realm, okay? And that you don't control the information you're given as such, but you can at least control a little bit more on how quickly you get it, no, not how quickly you get it, but how quickly you interpret it. Okay, and so the only way that you can speed up or increase the amount that you receive, or information you receive in your higher consciousness, and how much access you have to higher consciousness, as I said before, is dependent on Yeda, which we'll go on to when we regard that rune itself. We need progressive amounts of Yeda within us. But as I say, the Ansuz itself is very subtle, but actually quite powerful, because knowledge is power, right? And you're gaining knowledge, spiritual knowledge, and Ansuz can help you gain that. And so actually it's very useful rune for those of you who are interested in progressing your knowledge of paganism, of our religion, of the spiritual side of things, and it is something that is very useful in, as I say, in trance, as a result, to expand your knowledge and your base and higher self. Now, within divination, Ansuz is very rarely seen as a warning. Some runes can be seen as a warning and interact with the runes around them, because you cast the runes essentially in a very similar manner that you would cast bones. In fact, bones were originally used before runestones were made, and so it's not the runestones themselves that give power or the interpretation. The power still comes from within you, within runestone divination, but the runestones make it a little bit easier to interpret, because obviously there's a visual cue there, essentially, and a power associated with that visual sort of geometrical shape in front of you. And Ansuz, when it comes up, regardless of whatever runes are around it, as I say, it very rarely represents a warning or anything along those lines, anything negative as such, but it does represent something important. It often represents that a decision is about to be made in potentially a life-changing event. Now, whether that decision is right or wrong, it won't tell you that, but it will indicate when a decision is either going to be made or has been made. Whether how it lands obviously determines whether it's sort of interpreting the past, the present, or the future. And obviously then you've got the immediate past and the distant past, and the immediate future and the distant future. Depending on how it lands, obviously it will tell you what time frame it's representing, but it will tell you, as I say, that most likely that there's been a decision made, and that decision was life-changing at one point, and obviously the nature of that decision will then kind of be indicated by the runes that are around it. So it interacts with the runes that are nearby it, and so it will give you more of an understanding of what's going on. If it appears alongside an event, so one of the other runes appear showing that something's going to happen, then what it does here is that maybe not that a decision's been made, but that the event is actually almost like a destiny or a very, very strong fate at the very least, and as a result is an unavoidable fate or unavoidable occurrence in your life. So it could show you that you're going to come across a life-changing event potentially, or you know, when we say life-changing, we don't necessarily mean it's going to turn your life upside down, but something's going to change in life. It could be minor or major, it doesn't really matter. Ansuz won't necessarily tell you that by itself. As I say, it depends on how it interacts with your runes, but when it is associated alongside a rune that's showing something of an event occurring in your life, then it will say that the event is essentially unavoidable. There's nothing you can do. So why worry, essentially? But as I say, whether that is a good thing or a bad thing, it doesn't really matter. When something's unavoidable, like a destiny, it's unavoidable, and there's nothing you can really do. But you know, forewarned is forearmed, at least, I suppose. So you can just at least put preparations in to sort of deal with, if it's a bad event, to deal with the consequences. So it can be useful in divination, very useful, but as I say, it's less representative itself of something direct. typically interacts with other things. That's why I always say that Ansuz is very subtle in its presentation. It's subtle in life, and as I say, it's beautiful to observe because, for example, I didn't really talk about it too much before, but Ansuz, for example, it is directly represented in speech, as I say. And so when we speak or when we communicate to others, Ansuz is all immediately taking effect. And of course, what happens is we have a thought, and this is what we are trying to communicate with people. But that thought has to be married up perfectly with action, and it can only be matched up perfectly with action, i.e. the speech of the words that are coming out your mouth, when there is the original intention or the original thought is sort of corrupted, essentially, and it just goes straight into words. But more often than not, we have an intention, or we have a thought that then becomes an intention, but then that intention is not the reason. That is not the intention that is used to produce the words. The thought process is the same, but there's an intention over here, or there are a couple of intentions that interact, which show our personal investment in what we say. So it shows our interaction with the outside world and going, actually, I'm not going to say it in the truest way possible. I'm going to twist it, or lie, or do whatever. I'm going to take the original intention and corrupt it so that it's interpreted in a different way, or that it brings about even a possibly opposite effect, as I say, by producing a lie. And so Ansuz is pure in its own respect, but we can corrupt what comes after Ansuz and manipulate the words that we say that come after it. And this is where, but ultimately Ansuz is most powerful when it is left alone. Honesty is the best policy when it comes to Ansuz. It's most powerful, as I say, when the original intention or the original thought marries up perfectly with the action, i.e. the words or the speech or the communication that comes after it. And so we see this, for example, with historical figures, for example, when they truly believe in what they're saying, when they are telling you the truth, when they are for the people, so to speak, rather than subjugating the people, their words have greater meaning to those around them. They can influence those around them to a far greater degree than if they were, for example, lying or manipulating the truth, or telling the truth but telling it in a way, as I say, that influences people towards a vested interest of that individual. But people, whether they believe them or not, even if they believe them, there's a part of you that always is never influenced as much by a lie than you are the true, honest truth, the absolute truth. And so, as I say, Ansuz is weakened by your internal intentions, essentially. But that's when you see, as I say, the most influential figures in history are typically those people who are like outlaws, or and stuff like this, who are protecting the people against subjugation and stuff. And the reason that they can influence people so much is because they have a greater connection to them. When they speak, their words have a greater influence over people, because speech is very powerful. Speech, as I say, gets shit done. It's a way that people communicate with other people and can command people. Speech can be a command. Don't forget that. Not just a request or anything like that. You can command people and tell them what to do. And if they believe, as I say, the Ansuz is behind it, that it's powerful enough to manipulate their minds, then you can manipulate people. We see it all the time. People get manipulated through the power of Ansuz all the time, and this is how powerful Ansuz can be, because if you can manipulate people enough through Ansuz, understanding it and being able to apply it to your words as fully as possible, allowing it to flow, as I say, undiluted, uncorrupted by your own original, your own ambitions and interests and that, so to speak, then you can become a very influential figure indeed. So, as I say, it's just an interesting rune to talk about, and I hope you enjoyed the discussion, guys. I think I've probably missed a couple of bits off it, but I've discussed the main bits at least, especially when there's not a whole lot to talk about this rune, because it doesn't really do anything in Magic. But I hope, as I say, that you can go out and train your mind to be able to observe Ansuz through other people's speech patterns, for example, and as I say, for that feeling of being calm, or whether you feel like there's a nagging element to you, it can influence your ability to walk your fate path correctly, and by observing it, you can then begin to observe yourself, and you can observe whether your words are true or not.